Martin Feinstein became aware of the fact that Slava was leaving. He was exiled because of his support for Solzhenitsyn. So he decided to leave. I don't know that he settled any one place. But at some point, he became a visitor to New York. And Lloyd Symington, myself, and Krieger went up to New York to visit Slava, meet him, in the apartment of somebody named Remy Saunders, who was a Russian lady who specialized in receiving the emigres from Russia. We went to the apartment, and the first thing we heard was the voice of Galina, who was in the bedroom practicing. She was still a diva. And then Slava emerged, and we had a nice discussion. He was renowned as a cellist, but he wasn't a conductor. So there was a bit of an issue in the ranks of the orchestra and the board. But Feinstein was quite persuasive that, notwithstanding that I think Time magazine wrote an article, it was a Faustian contract, because Martin said it's the public relations value of getting somebody who's a world-class star outweigh whatever deficiencies there might be with some of the repertoire, not the Russian repertoire. There was a debate over salary, and I think Krieger was not offering him what he wanted, what he wanted was the salary equivalent to the top orchestras. I got into the act by persuading Dave that we got to do, I think it's worth it to get Slava, because he was very engaging that first evening. Even then he was running around hugging everybody in the apartment. So the deal that we made was to pay him less than he wanted, but we'd add to that later on, and that was done. Dave offered him $200,000, he wanted $300,000. And I got into the act by saying, well, if you can't get together, promise to do it later when he's, and we did when I was president. So the difference was made up. And he was happy, but in the meantime, we sort of had a special relationship because I was a partisan for him. In good faith, I thought he was going to be great for the presence of the orchestra, because it was kind of cruel. And Feinstein, again, being the Svengali of this operation, said, you know, that's life. So he was fired. And he came to see me, actually. He said, this is an outrage, because I'm a qualified person, which he was, and there's no excuse for this kind of treatment. I says, well, it's kind of late. We'll do what we can. But the die was cast. People wanted him. The core group. He made a great splash when he arrived and had a flair for some of the special events, as you well know. But my recollection is that as time went on, and he was here with us 17 years, as I remember, he became old hat. I used to go quite regularly to Europe, particularly Paris, and he was an icon ×5 over there. And I never understood. I came back here, people had no sense of this. They knew he was a genius. Most of the evenings, except after some of the major concerts, where we'd take him to dinner afterwards, he would be by himself in his apartment.
Well, what was your relationship like with Slava?
Well, it was intensely personal, because we sort of had a chemistry. I was available for him if he wanted to push for something. I was glad to do that. Some of the, I can't remember, but there's always a bit of intrigue on the board, and I stuck with him. And then when I was in Europe, for example, the night that Mitterrand was elected, he and I were together alone in his apartment, Avenue Georges Mondel, 42 Georges Mondel. And he's a friend of whoever is the boss. He said, this is the right guy. And we could hear, this is a true story, in his apartment, all the shouting in the streets. They say it came from the Place de la Bastille, I'm not sure, but they had planned to have Princess Grace, because, by the way, he knew her very well, and the children, I met them because of that. He was going to bring her over to do the Carnival of the Animals.
Grace Kelly for the Country Girl.
The thrill of this moment keeps me from saying what I really feel. I can only say thank you with all my heart to all who made this possible for me. Thank you.
'83.
Was that 83? Well, then I was before that. And my wife, I'll give her credit. She said, well, because they were talking, who would be the manager then? Was it Steve Klein or something?
That would be Henry Fogel.
Fogel. Well, they said, we'll get Danny Kaye. And Elaine said, that's ridiculous. We'll get Nancy Reagan. And I went to see Deaver, and of course Nancy jumped at the opportunity. You were playing, I guess, that evening. Well, it was a great event, as you could imagine.
But I said yes because it was Grace. And she was my friend.
Well, you hadn't done anything like that for a long time.
No.
And,
no.
Was there an anxiety about
I was
doing
scared
it?
to death. I was scared to death. I'd never walked out on the stage with a concert orchestra. You know, the whole thing was so brand new to me. I don't think I could have gotten through it without Rostropovich. He was so dear. And I think that Grace must have been looking down and saying, now you can do it, Nancy, and giving me help.
Rostropovich was electrifying,
Yeah.
and only as he could be. And I don't think it was an act. I think he, no matter where we played, whether it was in the States, on a residency in Alaska, every concert meant something to him. Did that come across to you?
Oh, sure, yeah.
How do you describe, how would you describe it?
Well, I could tell you that at the end of a concert, he was pretty tired. I mean, he could then get up at the party and drink too damn much vodka or wine, but before that occurred, he'd go in his dressing room then, and he was perspiring all over and drained. I think that's pretty evident.
We know that Slava was not happy when he left Washington because he wanted to stay. How did that come about?
He wanted to have 20 years.
Wanted to have 20 years.
Well, it was Jim. Jim, you'd have to talk with him. But my impression was that he got word from the orchestra that they were disappointed because he wasn't doing his homework. I don't know if that's so, but that's what Jim told me at the time.
Did you come to Russia with us when we went to Russia?
Sure.
You were there,
first time.
1990?
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
Oh, it was very exciting. We went over at that time. The oldest daughter, Olga, married an Hermes. This is the famous clothing. And that was an evening that impossible to forget. They had a wedding that started in Paris, first at the I can't remember the sequence of it, but the Palais Garnier, the old opera house. Olga appeared in a gold Yves Saint Laurent thing at the top of, do you remember the stairway, the escalier? Surrounded by 50 violinists, and Le Tout Paris was there. That's only the beginning, because then there was a great dinner followed by a reception at the Musée Marmottan, and then a ceremony at the Russian church. We stood for an hour and a half with candles for this marriage. And then they had a plane and took us, it's a good story in a way, they chartered a plane. There's just a couple of American couples. One of Galina's buddies, Sklar, do you know that name? She sort of was a lady-in-waiting to Galina when she was here. But we went over from there, from Paris to Morocco, Marrakesh, which is in one quarter of that called the Palmeraie. They have these wealthy, well-known French families. So we, after they arrived, the first night was Yves Saint Laurent's palace, and the next night was the father and mother of the groom. And they had this enormous place, and they had, in the invitations, had tenue blanche. You had to wear white, nothing but white. At the gate, the huge lawn covered with carpeting. And at each place they had dancers, singers, as you walk towards the tribune out in the great lawn, I guess, where, contrary to the rules, there was all kinds of alcohol served. And then came Russian music and French music blaring, and all of a sudden 2 horses galloped in front of the audience. This was the son and the father. And then everybody danced till 2 in the morning, I think. And, they had a big dinner and a play. It was an evening you could never forget. And then we came back. The next day, they actually had a civil ceremony, but he had to get back, and I was glad in a small plane owned by the king of Morocco. But in the plane was not only Slava, my wife, and myself, and I think Galina as well, but also a fellow who was then the mayor, or they call him the governor of St. Petersburg, named Sobchak. I mention that because his deputy was Vladimir Putin. And see, he took over St. Petersburg when we were chasing to Paris. But I will only add that by the time we reached Paris, they had killed at least 1 bottle of scotch, whether it was more or not. But it didn't bother him. He got off the plane as if nothing had happened. It was amazing. Sobchak was a bit dizzy, but the other... So how could you forget an evening like that or an affair like that? Impossible. Slava was one, and he's unique. The way his warmth and energy underlying the warmth was unparalleled, really.
He was so unusual in that way, and I'm still trying to figure out how a force of nature like Slava, what creates a force of nature like this?
Well, it starts with his parents, I gather, were accomplished musicians. And he was raised in the Russian tradition, which overrides everything. So he had to be a genius to begin with. And I gather that he had scores in his head, one after the other, which in itself is, how you do that, I'll never know.
Do you think about Slava? Does he come into your mind at times?
Oh, sure.
Why would you think of Slava?
Well, it was a golden era, I thought, for the orchestra. I may be egotistical about that, but we had, apart from the affair with the princess, with Nancy Reagan, we had several other evenings, one of which was Armand Hammer's birthday, when Isaac Stern came around and got in the orchestra and fiddled with a violin. And he said, he said earlier, I'm going to give, as a result of this, $250,000. And then he got on the stage, allegedly so excited, he says, I'm doubling my gift. I mean, those events, I don't see any of that happening. And I have to give my wife plenty of credit. I mean, we did things for the board, you may remember. We had everybody to dinner at the Watergate, which was then a destination point. I think he came up to me and said the orchestra needs chairs. Were you there then? We got totally new chairs for the orchestra.
Whose request was that?
Yeah, I think
it came from the orchestra.
Somebody, it got to me. Could have been Fogel, I don't know at this point.
Maybe. And you were able to
Well, I
deliver.
just did. Another occasion, he said, I'll redo to your, he said, the world's greatest composer. He wants to do a movement. Would you come up with the funding? And I says, what can I say? Couldn't say no. So that would occur from time to time. At some point, he decided he wanted to build a special house for Galena. And up in northern New York State, I think it's Jordanville, I'm not sure I have the right name. It's between Albany and Syracuse, I think. But it's a distance. He built this mansion and outfitted it with what he felt Galena wanted, including all her cosmetics in a medicine cabinet. And it's a huge estate. There were there was a Russian church there, and maybe a school as well. We went up one winter, it's just about a little early, in February. It was bitterly cold, and we went around this place. It was, this family, Sklar, had a lot to do with supervising the construction. But he had a caretaker and other people. It was cost him a lot of money. And ultimately, he sold it. But the particular weekend that he left us early morning Sunday to go visit Solzhenitsyn. He and Galena, they were driving Maine or wherever it was Solzhenitsyn was. But he had an organ. I mean, it was a real place. But Galena, she didn't like it at all, although she did write her book there.
Oh.
Finished it, I'm not sure which. But she felt that he was a great star, and sometimes she wasn't appreciated, and she got tired of that here. Now, at the time of Gorbachev, it wasn't the weekend with the orchestra, it was another event. He decided to give a birthday party for his wife. And I think it was, I'm sure it was the Bolshoi. They had the opera house decorated all flowers. You couldn't see anything but live flowers. Galena said it was something called the Chopin Foundation. I don't know where that came, who knows. But he had her sitting on a sort of a throne, and circling her were all the parts that she had played. Whether they were models or opera singers, I don't know, but each one would parade and bless her in some way. It was very dramatic. And then at the end, Slava leapt on the stage, got down on his knees and made a great prayer for her. It was a very emotional evening, and the place was jammed, as you could imagine. There was an auction. Some of the artifacts the two daughters put on the market, or the mother. And I saw the catalog from Sotheby's. It was listed at 4.5 million British pounds. And lo and behold, an oligarch came in and overcame the auction, took it over, and gossip is that he paid, there's a lot of gossip, many millions, some of which they say the artifacts ended up in Putin's dacha, but the family got a ton of money. They have no... The Avion Music Festival included, whether part of that or separately, they had a musical cruise. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I've heard of them. They would go on, they'd play on these cruises.
Well, not only play, he had a symphony. They had, I don't know if it was a full group, but again, from Eastern Europe usually, there'd be an orchestra. And I remember Mazel on one of those, and certainly Stern. And it was about a week we traveled in the Aegean Sea. Anne Sophie came on one of these, and she played in Turkey, I guess. We got an outdoor amphitheater, very dramatic. The orchestra was Slava conducting and Anne Sophie playing the violin. It was a pretty... it seemed to me that this was an amphitheater. If you dropped a pin in the center, you could hear it up.
And then in 1993, we came back to Russia and we played in Red Square.
Yeah, I was there. I almost got crushed to death.
Oh,
yeah.
Very cold.
I remember that. He did the Tchaikovsky Fifth Symphony.
1812.
1812 Overture, yeah.
With the bells, you know, in the back.
And the crowning moment in Red Square. For Slava, this concert was a further step toward unity.
I already feel that for me, not so separate United States and Russia. My home is this planet.
But it was very cold and windy, and we were trying to play our instruments.
Oh, that was a very exciting. It couldn't have been more exciting. I got caught in the crowd with all these big guys. I tell you, the closest I ever came to feeling like I was finished. I managed to get out. But that was a very dramatic affair, and he was very emotional about the whole thing as well.
Yes.
Now, I'll give you another incident that's not but it's part of his humanity. This is something that should be known. Remember Bella Davidovich or Davidovich?
Yes.
He brought her over. Well, you may know this. You were here. We had a dinner afterwards at Jean-Louis. And well, you know the rest of the story.
I don't know the rest of the story, but I remember that we had to cancel a concert.
Yeah. Well, Jean-Louis says, I'm ordering everything. You don't have to think about that. I'll get any. What he started with was crab soup with heavy cream. So you got this big bowl, crab in the middle, and he poured this stuff over it. I can't handle anything, unfortunately for me, but Bella and Slava gobbled this stuff. She's a little woman. And there was something wrong with the crab, and they couldn't get out of bed the next morning, so that's why they canceled it. But a couple of days later, he called me, he says, I want to go to Jean-Louis again, because I want to show him that even though we had a catastrophe, I'm still his partisan. And I feel, I want to show that support by going back to, this is a big legacy. He called up, Nadja called and said, Slava wants to have lunch. We went to the Jockey Club. And he said, I want to start a foundation for children. And he said, here are my friends, Agnelli, Manu, and he rattled off a bunch of big Japanese guys who supported the concerts, 10 or 12. And he said, the first thing I'll do is do a concert to help children. And it began at the Russian embassy. And it was $10,000 a couple. And I had the job of trying to rustle up people. I remember Kiplinger and his wife, but we got about 7 or 8 couples. That was the best I could do. He didn't like that. So he gave the concert. That was step 1. Step 2 was he had planned a concert for Jackie Onassis. She died. So Sotheby said, well, we're going to do the estate, so we'll give the dinner. And he designated his son-in-law, Olaf, the one with the Hermes guy, to get the people. Fortunately, again, he did a cello thing by himself, and he was disappointed with that. I should tell you, you'll see this picture. This, I give my wife full credit. Jane Weinberger, the wife of the Secretary of Defense, when Reagan came, she said, I think, Jane was on the board, I think we should do something for Slava and Weinberger. And the deal was that Weinberger would invite the president, Reagan, to our home. And he did. And they were going to get Walter Annenberg and his wife. She was chief of protocol at that time. And then he'd be cornered by Slava and give $1 million to the symphony. There's always something. Well, the wife was on duty in Canada in a snowstorm. She couldn't get back. But after a week, the house was, closed the curtains. They had the Secret Service all over the place. It was a Sunday, and they came from Camp David to the house. Most of the people were people he designated from Reagan's cabinet. We had a few of our friends. But then afterwards, at the dinner, there were about 30 people. Oh, I should tell you that he was, of course, it was to have him play. And he says, well, the only thing I have to have Lambert Orchestra, you have to get a piano in the house, which wasn't automatic.
President Reagan and members of the cabinet and Senate, and there we were. We had not rehearsed yet. It was a 20-minute program. We went into the living room and we rehearsed quietly and in double tempo, 10 minutes to get through the whole program.
But they had a short concert, and we came in and had a great affair. And afterwards, he gave, only in America, this is a great country, free. I don't think we have a recording of this, unfortunately, but it was quite an evening, as you could imagine. It'll never be duplicated again. Several days later, the head of the Smithsonian and Roger Stevens called me for lunch, maybe a week later. And they said, I said, what do you need? What do you need? He says, well, we know you had the Reagans for dinner. We want to find out how you did it. No, that's not the story. We walked out. This was the Metropolitan Club. And we heard sirens. I thought maybe the president was going, this cortege was off to, but in fact, he had been shot. So we saw the presidential limousines racing to GW Hospital that very day. But the foundation, the first thing, we had about $80,000. And some Polish architect had come along. He said, you have to build a hospital. I said, well, you can't build a hospital for $80,000, out of the question. He said, that's all right, Yeltsin has given me the hospital. And Nadja and I went over to Moscow, and what turned out to be the hospital was a concrete and steel frame with a bunch of junk all around it. And we heard at the time that Yeltsin was offering it to anybody who was going to step in. So that took care of the $80,000. But we then got the idea of children's health. And it started with a program at that time whereby you could take an X-ray in Nizhny Novgorod, an outlying place, and we had a contact with the Georgetown Pediatric. You could send this by a telephone line, so old-fashioned now, to Washington, so they could diagnose somebody in Washington who was ill in Nizhny Novgorod, as an example. That led Slava wasn't too interested in that. He didn't see it. We came up with the idea of vaccinations. And that has led now, since that time, the foundation got funding from the U.S. government. At that time, the Food for Progress, we had excess soybean meal, and they used that to feed chickens, and it had a big market over there. And we have vaccinated more than 40 million children since then. I've been chairman of that until just a few months ago. Thomas Pickering was undersecretary. He's taken over him. But this is now we're into Palestine, because Elena is now the president since her father died, and she wants to deal with helping the Palestinians, which we're now doing. But it's all health.
And Slava was behind.
Oh, 100%. And we have a lot in the archives from him going to the hospitals in various parts of Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. And if part of your archives, I'm sure we could furnish you with.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you
speaking
with me and taking some time today.
No, I'm glad to do it.